Before we get into today's video, please quickly check below to see if you've subscribed. It's totally free and allows you to never miss one of our videos. Running away and being chased by humans? This was the last concern of the crew of the Unior exploratory vessel when their hypercore melted during a standard exploratory mission. Captain Ahagan stood near the central console, his broad, tusk-lined jaw tense beneath a nose flattened by generations of his kind's rugged evolution. His shoulders, layered in rigid plates of dark green skin, rose and fell as he surveyed the vessel's crystallized interior. The surfaces around them refracted the ambient glow of passing stardust into a spectrum of subtle hues, all shaped into sharp angles and arches. He tapped the universal printer's interface and turned to his maintenance officer.
"Do we have the materials to fabricate another hypercore, Axon?"
he asked, voice exuding authority. Axon, the maintenance technician, lifted his gaze from a console at the base of a wide crystalline support beam. He was smaller than the captain, but still taller than any bipedal species they had catalogued so far, with a thick spine curving forward and tusks that curled inward in a slight, permanent scowl. His forearms bulged with muscle, and his fingers ended in blunt claws well suited for prying open access panels. He stared at the readouts, narrowing his yellow eyes.
"It's not a matter of whether the universal printer can shape a new core,"
he replied, each word accompanied by a subtle click of his tusks,
"but whether we have enough raw mass. I need to run calculations on what's left in our cargo holds."
Before Axon could begin, the navigator, Bliran, rolled his broad shoulders and turned from the panoramic scope. He was of the same basic build, tusks, greenish hide, and elongated limbs, but his frame leaned toward lean muscle, and a set of intricate markings ran across his cheekbones. He nodded at the captain, tapping the navigation interface with thick fingertips.
"Forget the calculations. We're in a system with a yellow star at its heart, multiple rocky worlds, and at least one planet with abundant oceans," he said. "Before we start printing a new core, perhaps we should scan the region more thoroughly. We might be able to source materials from the third planet, whatever it's called."
His eyes flicked to Axon and then back to the captain.
"If we find the right ores and elements, we won't have to scrape the bottom of our storage units and risk everything we have. It's not ideal to deplete our resources, but exploring one extra planet might actually reflect well on us in the report."
Captain Ahagan considered Bilran's suggestion, tusks parting slightly in thought.
"Very well. Begin a deep scan of the third planet."
The atmosphere in the crystal corridors of the Unior ship took on a certain tension as they repositioned to survey the system, a timely process. The scanners began their sweep, revealing a planet blanketed in green-brown continents, warm seas, and patterns of weather that suggested stable, temperate zones. There was no evidence of high-altitude structures or artificial satellites. Small gravitational tugs hinted at untapped deposits of minerals scattered across the surface. This seemed precisely the sort of place they could descend and harvest what they needed, raw matter to feed into the universal printer's hunger for materials. As the ship drifted closer, Bliran ran an extended-range analysis, sending numerous probes to collect and analyze samples.
"The third planet appears to be geologically active,"
he said, steadying his voice with professional calm.
"I see concentrations of iron and rare metals near inland formations. The vegetation is thick in some regions, and I'm detecting living beings. Not advanced by any measure, just scattered groups of tool-using primates. They appear bipedal, but their structures, if you can even call them that, are rudimentary. No metals, no electricity, no refined fuels."
Axon's brow furrowed.
"Simple creatures,"
he muttered, busy with the calculations.
"I'm adding their biomass and the planet's composition to my estimates. It will take a few moments."
He tapped in more commands, scowling as he thought through the printer's requirements.
"If we break into the planet's crust in a few key spots, we can get what we need.
I'll let you know the exact quantities and extraction times soon.
Outside the viewport, the planet rolled slowly, revealing clean coastlines and inland basins that seemed untouched by any smart civilization. Perhaps it never would, from the perspective of the three Uniors. It was a lush orb inhabited by scattered communities of primitive, upright walking apes that had yet to shape stone into anything more than crude edges. There were no cities, no agriculture, just roaming bands gathered in a single continent and foraging under a yellow sun.
You know,
Bliran said as he finished a pass with the sensors,
we could send down a set of small probes, land them in those mineral-rich zones, let them measure the density and purity of the elements we need. While we're at it, we can assess the nature of these primates.
He tapped a few keys, and the ship dispatched a trio of small observational devices, each a crystal shard programmed to gather data from a low altitude. As the probes descended, they relayed images of wide grasslands, herds of large mammals, and groups of ape-like creatures huddling in simple camps, tools of stone and bone, fires, but only rudimentary. From orbit, these beings had no more presence than any other wild creature. Captain Ahagan nodded, stroking a tusk thoughtfully.
The planet's resources look promising,
he said.
Iron, tungsten, cobalt. Most raw materials we'd need to shape a hypercore. If these creatures are as unformed as they appear, we may land without issue.
He looked from Axon, still crunching his numbers, to Bliran, who was making notes on topographical overlays.
We'll settle in a mineral-rich region, isolate it. We'll need to refine the ores before the printer can create anything stable.
Axon straightened, a satisfied grunt escaping his throat.
I have the calculations,
he said, arms folded.
We'll need a fair amount of mass, but it's all there. We can strip the necessary minerals from the crust. And these upright primates, they might be docile enough. We could attempt to domesticate them as free labor.
He shrugged, as if the notion were as common as drilling through an asteroid.
They don't seem to possess true language or deep understanding. We will be gods to them.
Bliran nodded, tapping a region on the holographic display, a place that would, in some distant future, be called the African continent.
We land here, he said. Wide plains, easy to set up a temporary mining operation, minimal constructions from the locals.
Captain Ahagan gave a single nod of agreement. The Unior ship prepared its descent, engines roaring as they approached the surface. They had no inkling that these primitives would one day reshape the planet, nor did they imagine the species they dismissed so easily would scatter across continents and beyond, one day rising to the galactic stage as a force to be respected, if not feared. For now, all that mattered to them was the hypercore, and the simple minds below who might serve a help, or at least some entertainment. The vessel descended steadily through thin wisps of atmosphere. As it neared the chosen site, a low plateau studded with mineral deposits, the captain gave a curt nod to his crew. The impact was gentle, a controlled settling rather than a jolt. Almost at once, Captain Ahagan barked an order.
Begin the operation.
Axon stepped forward, pressing his thick fingers against a shiny crystal embedded in the main console. With a faint cracking sound, the ship's hull fractured into multiple segments, each module scuttling across the ground on jointed legs of crystal and alloy. In moments, drills engaged and began burrowing into the soil, scooping out raw materials for the universal printer's future use. Axon looked over the readouts, his tusks clicking thoughtfully.
The operation is partially automated,
he said, voice low.
But we're using almost all of our heavy equipment here. We can refine the ores into fused ingots on site, but then we have to carry those ingots back to the universal printer. Doing this by hand could cost us days. If we could find a way to move them more efficiently, we could shave off precious time.
Captain Ahagan folded his heavy arms.
What about fabricating additional carrier units?
The technician scowled, flexing his shoulders in annoyance.
We could, but that requires the very materials we're trying to obtain for the hypercore. Building more carriers would mean delaying the completion of the core itself.
Bliran leaned in with a grin that pushed his tusks forward.
Why not use the locals? He suggested. We have a system for first contact. My guess, they'll worship us as gods if we bring a few trinkets. Then we can make them haul the ingots for us. They're primitive, yes, but I'm sure we can manage a simple trade. Or at least get them to follow us.
Captain Hagen considered this, then tilted his head in agreement.
Very well, he said. We'll approach them. We'll suit up in the exoskeletons and load our packs with the simplest supplies. Let's see if these creatures respond to gifts.
Moments later, the three Uniors donned their travel gear. Each exoskeleton was formed of lightweight metal frames that wrapped their broad torsos, with reinforced boots and segmented gauntlets. A compact pack of essential tools and emergency provisions rested between their shoulder blades, ensuring their hands remained free. When everything was prepared, they marched across uneven ground, guided by Bliran's navigation scanner. The grass bent under their heavy steps, startled animals darting away. Eventually, they spotted the tribe's encampment, a small clearing circled by makeshift shelters, piles of furs, and a few smoking pits of fire. The inhabitants, ape-like, upright forms draped in rough hides, stood or crouched near the fires, holding stone-tipped sticks and peering nervously into the wilderness. As the Uniors emerged, the primitives stiffened, gripping their tools tighter. The Uniors looked at one another, suppressing laughter at how tense these creatures seemed as they hid their children inside their shelters. So frail, so easily intimidated. Captain Hagen raised a hand, and all three activated their language acquisition devices, small earpieces designed to decode spoken patterns. They weren't sure what kind of complexities they'd find here, if any, but it was worth a try. The primitives moved cautiously, encircling the three Uniors with crude stone-tipped spears held high. Their movements were hesitant, but somehow coordinated, their small dark eyes flicking between the Uniors, their focus directed to the weirdness of their exoskeletons. While moving, they barked guttural sounds at one another, a language the Uniors' devices would need extensive exposure to parse beyond the basics. Captain Hagen stood his ground, his tusks shifting slightly as he regarded the advancing circle.
Bliran, keep recording their behaviors. We'll need data to have a chance to decipher their language.
Bliran nodded, tilting his scanner subtly as he logged every step and gesture the natives made. Their tools were primitive, their formation loose, a desperate attempt to intimidate more advanced creatures they couldn't possibly understand. Still, the pointy sticks seemed sharp enough to pierce flesh, though none of the Uniors were concerned. Axon glanced at a particularly bold primitive who jabbed his weapon toward the captain, the point trembling in his unsteady grip.
They've got spirit,
Axon muttered with a toothy smirk.
But they're outmatched in every way.
His thick fingers flexed against the trigger of his sidearm, though he made no move to draw it. Captain Hagen raised a hand slowly, palm outward, exposing his belly in what he believed to be a universal gesture of peace. His exoskeleton whirred faintly as he crouched, lowering himself closer to the native's eye level.
No threat,
he said, testing if the data collected so far would be enough for a rudimentary translation. The words made the primitives pause, their muttering falling silent. A few glanced nervously at one another, but their circle held. The leader, a broad-shouldered figure with streaks of ash smeared across his face, stepped closer, his spear raised but wavering. Bliran leaned in toward the captain.
We might be getting through to them. They don't seem as hostile now.
Keep it that way,
Hagen murmured.
No sudden moves. Let them think we're gods, not monsters. Should we offer our gifts now?
Axon suggested, going as far as proposing a competition.
What do you guys say we turn this into a little competition? Whoever gives the most useless gift wins.
The captain didn't seem thrilled by the idea, but Bliran smiled and stepped forward, accepting the challenge.
Watch this,
he said quietly to the others, holding out a crystal that glowed brightly even under the midday sun. He turned it slowly, letting its light spill onto the ground and over the faces of the natives. One of the primates stepped closer, grabbing the crystal that was being offered, and passed it to another. Soon, several were squabbling over it, yelping in their strange tones as they pushed and shoved. The Uniors tensed, expecting a violent skirmish, but it ended with a few rough jabs and some kind of grunting compromise. The crystal ended up held by a female figure who gazed into its luminous facets with wonder.
Not bad,
Axon said with a smirk.
But you think that's the best we can do?
He reached into a side pouch and withdrew a small, flat mirror. He approached with slow, cautious steps, holding it so that the curious natives could see their own reflections. Gasps and low moans filled the clearing. They passed the mirror around, tilting it and marveling at the faces peering back. They pressed their fingertips against the surface, tried to touch the images, and chattered. The fascination was immediate and deep, greater even than the shiny crystal. Captain Ahagan snorted softly.
You two are trying too hard.
He reached into his backpack, rummaging calmly. Then he pulled out a single scrap of sharp-edged metal, a leftover piece from some earlier repair. He offered it to the nearest native. They turned it in their hands, feeling its smoothness and razor-thin edge. Quickly, more of them crowded in, comparing the metal's cutting potential to their own stone flakes. They pressed it gently against bits of hide and wood, marveling at how easily it could slice. It sparked excited chatter. Bliran's shoulders slumped, and Axon shook his head in grudging admiration.
Fine,
the technician muttered.
You won this round, Captain. Your scrap is something.
Bliran nodded in agreement, glancing at the astonished natives still engrossed in the metal shard. The three Uniors exchanged amused glances, pleased with their first contact. They had what they wanted: attention, interest, and perhaps soon cooperation. This tribe of primates had no idea what it was dealing with, and the Uniors fully intended to use that to their advantage. Not wanting to lose momentum, the three Uniors stood before the small gathering of natives, trying to convey their intent. Captain Ahagan held out a shard of metal, then tapped his own chest, and pointed toward the distance where their ship's modules were doing the mining. The primitives frowned and exchanged puzzled glances, uncertain what the gestures meant. Bliran crouched low, smoothing the ground with his broad fingertips, and began to draw a simple outline of the vessel and its surrounding pits. He sketched a line leading away from the village, then tapped the drawing and pointed off toward the horizon. The natives leaned forward, heads tilted, trying to decipher the meaning of these strange symbols. Axon activated his translator device and attempted a few syllables of the natives' grunts and chuffs. The sound it produced was stilted and hollow, and the primitives reacted with surprise rather than understanding. Still, Axon pressed on, adding a few simple tones that the translator had guessed might mean follow or come. One of the taller primitives took a hesitant step forward and pointed at the rough map in the dirt. He grunted a series of sounds that the translator couldn't fully parse. The Uniors heard only fragments of meaning. Go. Place? It was incomplete, but it was a start. The alien crew nodded encouragingly, repeating the gestures and tapping their chests again. The natives murmured among themselves, stealing glances at the strange objects on the Uniors' backs and the glistening metal in their hands. Slowly, they began to understand that these visitors wanted them to move to another place. The tribe's members hefted their stone-tipped sticks, looked at each other, and after some hesitant nods, formed a loose cluster behind the aliens. Satisfied, Captain Ahagan rose to his full height and turned in the direction of their distant mining site. With the natives now following, The three juniors set off, satisfied with the progress. Although their words were barely understood, the message had gotten through. The tribe would accompany them back across the landscape, toward the ship, the shimmering modules, and the possibility of a profitable exchange. As the small procession moved, Captain Ahagan spoke quietly to his crewmates.
"Are we certain they can keep up?"
he asked, adjusting his exoskeleton's shoulder straps.
"It's not a short distance."
"They seemed fit enough,"
Bliran said, glancing back at the natives who were already following without complaint.
"Still, I'm surprised. Look at their legs, shorter than ours, no mechanical advantage, yet they move with ease."
By the time the group reached the mining site, the modules had carved shallow pits and arranged gleaming ingots of refined metal along the edges. Ahagan carefully picked up one ingot, held it out, then pointed to the ship's intake port. The translator made a few tentative clicks and garbles, but mostly the crew relied on gestures. Soon the natives were mimicking their actions, hefting the dense ingots as though they weighed little more than a bundle of sticks. Axon handed out more metal scraps to the tribe as payment, and Bliran produced a glowing crystal when a particularly heavy load was delivered. The primitives marveled at these treasures, grunting and smiling in their own way. They carried row after row of ingots to the ship's universal printer, all without complaint, all for a handful of sharp or shining trinkets.
"This arrangement is more efficient than I ever imagined,"
Axon remarked, eyeing the printer's progress bar.
"We're saving hours, maybe days. The core will be ready much sooner now."
From that moment onwards, the day settled into a pattern almost too smooth to believe. Each dawn, before the sun fully crested the horizon, the natives were already gathered at the edge of the Unior's landing site. Their silhouettes formed a quiet line in the half-light, patiently awaiting their daily instructions with the kind of calm that the aliens had not anticipated. As soon as the first morning rays washed over the landscape, the Uniors would open their hatch, often yawning and stretching behind their crystal panels, sometimes even late to present themselves. Captain Ahagan and his crews had grown accustomed to this newfound labor force, leaning on the natives' strength, as if it were a simple machine they had assembled themselves. The primitives never faltered. They moved ingot after ingot, trudging over dust and uneven ground. Every so often, Axon would toss out a scrap of metal or a glowing crystal, just enough to keep the natives enthusiastic. Some days the Uniors would distribute these trinkets with a casual flick of the wrist, other days with barely concealed boredom, as if tossing crumbs to well-trained animals. Bliran, who once marveled at the natives' stamina, now lounged near the hull, barely paying attention as they streamed by. With a wry smirk, he'd occasionally whisper, "Look at them go," but his tone held none of the earlier wonder. The crew had grown lazy, leaving the hard work, lifting, hauling, sweating, to their unsuspecting helpers. Axon spent more time recalculating the printer's progress than noticing the individuals who carried the materials. Each ingot measured, accounted for, and slotted into the machine brought the Uniors closer to their completed hypercore. By the time another sunset lowered over the fields, the aliens had grown comfortable to the point of complacency. Captain Ahagan would nod approvingly at the stacks of completed work, barely acknowledging the lines of weary primitives heading back to their village. The promise of more scraps and crystals tomorrow was all that mattered. With this routine locked in place, the Uniors began to take the natives' efforts for granted, as just another component of their makeshift mining operation. One afternoon, just as Axon moved to begin the final refinement cycle from inside the bridge, he noticed a sudden flicker in the module's output readings. He tapped the console twice, then frowned.
"Captain,"
he called out, his voice showing his confusion.
"One of the modules just lost power."
Captain Ahagan turned sharply, tusks bared in irritation.
"Lost power?"
he repeated, marching over to the display that monitored the refining stations. He'd expected this day to run smoothly. No more delays, no more setbacks.
Axon, Bliran, what's going on?
Bliran hunched over another console, fingers jabbing at crystalline controls.
This is no minor fluctuation, he hissed. It just stopped. I'm reading a direct breach, sparks, unstable current flow. It's sabotage?
Axon snorted, pushing aside a protective panel to peer into the maintenance axis.
Sabotage? From who? The natives aren't smart enough to.
His voice trailed off as he caught sight of a small shape crumpled near the severed cable. Smoke curled faintly from the edges where the metal scrap had pierced through the insulation. The three Uniors fell silent as they realized what they were looking at. A native boy, one of the tribe's children, lay unconscious at the base of the module, his hand still wrapped around a piece of sharp metal. He must have been trying to cut something, perhaps out of curiosity, or perhaps playing with his strange, wondrous prize. But now he lay still, a faint mark on his skin and the cable sliced clean through. At that moment, they got to watch through a screen as the precise temperature and compositions of the molten metal in the refining chamber began to slip away. Without steady power, the mixture's careful balance collapsed. The glowing fluid solidified inside the pipes, turning into misshapen lumps of worthless slag. All they could do was stare, stunned, as what should have been their final perfect run was ruined in an instant. Captain Hagen let out a roar that echoed throughout the crystalline corridors.
We were this close!
He bellowed, storming toward the ruined refining station. He kicked aside a twisted chunk of metal that had once been a half-molded ingot.
3 days of work, gone because of a stupid primate!
His eyes darted between the collapsed mixture and the still form of the native boy. Bliran clenched his fists, slamming one hard against a crystal panel. A brittle crack raced through its surface.
It's worse than that, Captain!
He spat, his voice dripping with bitterness.
The pipes are ruined! The equipment! Everything is ruined!
Axon used all sensors to examine the damage, pressing his tusks against his chin in frustration. He grunted out a curse under his breath.
Days, Captain,
he said quietly, voice trembling with suppressed rage.
We'll lose days undoing this mess, not to mention the materials we've wasted.
Before any of them could decide what to do, a native female entered, pushing her way into the ship's interior, her shoulders hunched and trembling. She carried the child in her arms, his body limp, eyes closed. Her face was contorted in panic and grief. She prostrated herself before the Uniors, pressing her forehead to the metal deck. The translator caught only 2 words through her anguished chokes: "Please" and "save." Her voice cracked with desperation. Even without full understanding, the meaning was clear. She begged them to restore what life might be left in her son. Captain Hagen narrowed his eyes, nostrils flaring. He was furious at the setback, at the loss of time, at the idea of having to manually reheat the furnaces and refine all over again. He gave a small, contemptuous shake of his head, but before he could speak, Bliran stepped forward. With a sudden, savage motion, the navigator struck the woman across the face. The impact sent her sprawling. She scrambled backward, clutching the child closer, tears cutting trails down her dusty cheeks. Without another word, she retreated, stumbling toward the exit, her sobs echoing in the silence. Hagan rounded on Bliran, tusks bared.
What in the stars are you doing? We could have at least tried to calm them. Now they might not want to work for us anymore.
Bliran snarled back.
They interfered! They cost us days! We owe them nothing!
Axon stood to the side, trying to regain his composure as tension mounted in the cramped confines of the ship's chamber. Before the argument could truly erupt, they became aware of a presence behind them. Turning slowly, the Uniors found themselves face to face with a group of native males who had entered quietly and now blocked the exit. Each held a spear-like stick with a sharpened stone tip. Their eyes were no longer curious or friendly. They had hardened into something fierce, something that glinted with resolute anger. No one spoke, neither the natives nor the Unyors. The silence was complete, a charged and thick atmosphere. For the first time since they landed, the Unyors felt something akin to fear in their chests. The natives that were viewed as docile beasts of burden now had a wildness in their eyes, shoulders squared, legs braced. The angled shafts of their spears caught the light, and something in the way they moved suggested they were prepared to use them. The Unyors, so confident and dismissive before, suddenly felt cornered. In that electric stillness, it was impossible not to wonder how much strength these primitives might summon if they chose to strike back, even more so considering their numbers. Ahagan glanced left and right, eyes locked on the ring of spear-tipped sticks aimed their way. His tusks parted slightly, and his voice was low and controlled.
"We might have to fight,"
he said, stepping protectively in front of Axon and Bliran.
"But not here. We can't risk damaging the ship in a brawl."
Bliran let out a sharp breath, his eyes facing the open hatch at the opposite side of the line of natives.
"We can outrun them,"
he said in a hurried whisper, ignoring the surprise on Ahagan's face.
"They're strong, but look how they're armed. Stone-tipped sticks, nothing ranged beyond a throw. We have exoskeletons."
He gave a meaningful tap to the powered frame on his shoulders.
"We can lose them in the wilderness. Just run until they tire."
Axon's nostrils flared as he considered the proposal, but he gave a curt nod. Ahagan agreed with a grim set of his jaw. Without warning, the three Unyors bolted, pushing past the nearest natives and rushing into the open. The tribesmen shouted in surprise, then in anger, and soon the Unyor heard footsteps drumming the earth behind them. The chase had begun. They sprinted across uneven ground, over broken stones and scrubby grass, while the primitives pursued like a pack of silent hunters. At first, the Unyors were certain their mechanical advantage would carry them to safety. They leapt over crevices, splashed through shallow streams, and skirted around thickets of low brush, confident the natives would tire. Bliran dared to grin as he stole a glance behind.
"They're still following, but look at them pant. They can't keep this up."
Yet, as they pressed on, the Unyors soon noted something unsettling. The primitives did not slow. Hours passed. The sun began its descent, bathing the world in shifting light. Despite the heat, the natives continued, sweat pouring off their bodies in rivulets. Axon, breathing hard, muttered,
"They're cooling themselves, like a ship's active heat shield on atmospheric entry. Those drops, how can a trait like that even evolve?"
Captain Ahagan's eyes widened, panic tightening in his chest.
"They might outlast our batteries,"
he growled. Indeed, the exoskeleton's power indicators dipped lower every time he checked. Their suits grew heavier, the mechanical servos straining as their reserves dwindled. The apes, by contrast, seemed to rely on something far simpler, and yet more effective: flesh, muscle, and efficient bodies. After what felt like an eternity, Axon's exoskeleton began to whine and sputter. With a jolt, the power systems failed, and the technician stumbled.
"Captain, I have to shed the suit,"
he gasped, slowing to remove the now dead weight.
"Go on without me."
He knelt, wrestling with latches and clips. Ahagan and Bliran didn't dare stop, only to slow down.
"Hurry up, Axon,"
the captain called, looking back. But in that single backward glance, he saw a flash of movement, a spear arcing through the twilight. It struck Axon high on the neck, and the technician toppled wordlessly, body going limp. The captain bit back a cry. Bliran let out a choked curse. Yet all they could do was keep running. Shock and horror gnawed at them, but they kept going, pushing their bodies and their failing suits harder. The exoskeletons sputtered and slowed as their batteries approached zero. With a final, sad beep, both suits went dead. Without power, the metal frames were just dead weight. They stripped off as much as they could on the move, but even partial frames dragged on their limbs. Behind them, the humans surged forward, calls echoing over the land. Their voices now roared like a chorus of predators closing in. Bliran's breathing became ragged. He stumbled, caught himself, then stumbled again. "Captain!" he rasped, pressing a hand to his chest. His eyes were wide with panic and pain. Ahagan watched, helpless, as Bliran's knees buckled, his body simply refusing to go another step. The navigator toppled forward, face hitting the ground, chest heaving once, twice, and then going still. Bliran had run himself to death, collapsing under a star-filled sky. The captain heard the distant cheers, the howling battle cries of the primitives who never seemed to tire. Ahagan's vision blurred. His ship was distant. He had no crew. He was alone in a wilderness that felt infinite and hostile. His lungs burned, legs trembling. Night had fallen, and the chorus of insects mocked him with their endless songs. He realized with crushing despair that even if he kept running, he'd eventually collapse. And even if, by some miracle, he escaped, what then? He'd be stranded, miles from his vessel, in an alien world that had turned on him. He stopped, abruptly turning to face the darkness behind him. A twisted grin spread across his face. A man driven beyond reason.
"You'll never reach the stars,"
he croaked, voice cracking.
"Stay here! Stay primitive! Forever!"
His knees gave way. The last thing he saw was the silhouettes of the native hunters closing in. He took small comfort in the belief that these beings would never challenge them in the cosmos. His last thought flickered and died with him. In the days that followed, the ancient humans returned quietly to the strange ship. They found it deserted, its smooth hull partially cracked from the aliens' hurried departure. Over weeks and months, the tribe worked together to bury it beneath sand and soil, sealing away the crystalline corridors and ruined modules. They had no words for what it was, only that it had brought evil spirits and danger. The electrocuted child, who survived his ordeal, bore a branching scar that snaked over his skin, patterns that would later be seen as a sign of strength and wisdom. He grew to be a leader in time, the scar drawing attention as if it was a manifestation of lightning. Life resumed its old rhythms. The tribe returned to hunting and gathering, forgetting the details of the strange visitors, but passing down whispered tales of metal shining crystals and ugly green creatures who fell to their spears. The buried ship became a memory locked beneath the earth, its chambers silent, holding secrets no one understood. Ages passed, and humans grew beyond those simple ways. Thousands of generations later, the descendants of those hunter-gatherers dug into ancient ground, unearthing fragments of crystal and alloy. They did not see evil spirits or malevolent magic, but a partially completed hypercore, its design advanced in certain ways, yet nowhere close to being compared to magic.